Hello and welcome to this BYU Library Family History webinar. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Joe Everett and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You are also welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is on July 20th with Richard Miller. He will be giving a presentation entitled Find and Fix Tangles in Your Family Tree with Goldie May. If you would like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from Laura Lefler. She will be giving a presentation entitled Evidence Analysis: How to Become a Genealogist Detective. Before we begin, here's a little about Laura. Laura has a Bachelor of Arts in English and History from BYU. She is a retired English and U.S. history teacher. She also has a Salt Lake Community College genealogy certificate, a ProGen certificate, and is an accredited genealogist with a focus on the Upper South, which includes Kentucky, West Virginia, Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee. All of her ancestors are from the Upper South, and she has spent most of her childhood living through the South and loved it. For the past 5 years, she's been a volunteer at the BYU Family History Library in Provo, Utah, helping patrons with their family history. We will now turn the time over to Laura.
All right, if you want to be a better genealogist, then you need to remember this, quote, accuracy is fundamental to genealogical research. Without it, a family's history would be fiction. In this webinar, I will share how family historians have used concepts from the field of law, like detectives use, as guidelines when they're researching. You've heard the story. A detective arrives at a crime scene. A man has been murdered and he has to determine who committed the crime. He gathers evidence, seeks for information from reliable sources, looks for patterns, makes connections, determines what evidence is valuable and relevant and what isn't, all in an effort to reach a conclusion and solve the crime. He asks lots of who, what, when, where, why questions, like, who were you with on the night of the crime? Where were you at 10:30 p.m. last night? What relationship do you have with the victim? And so on and so on. Do all the pieces and all the clues fit together? Does it make sense? This process applies also to genealogical research. A genealogist gathers evidence, seeks for information from reliable sources, looks for patterns, makes connections, asks lots of questions to determine what evidence is valuable and relevant, all in an effort to prove a relationship or solve a research problem in the family tree. So a genealogist is a detective. A genealogist proves a relationship or solves a research problem in the family tree by analyzing sources, information, and evidence. Because without analysis, what you think is correct in your family tree may not be. For example, copying what you find in someone's online tree and putting it in your database may send you down the wrong path. Analysis of sources, information, and evidence will make you a much better researcher. This process of evidence analysis is part of the genealogical proof standard that was developed by the Board for Certification of Genealogists in an effort to create sound conclusions that can be considered proof in your research project. We do that by taking a careful look at our sources, the information we've accumulated, and the evidence. Here's a quote from Elizabeth Shown Mills, who's author of Evidence Explained. She says, quote, sources provide information from which we select evidence for analysis. A sound conclusion may then be considered proof, unquote. So first, analyze the source. And here's a tip on how to remember what you analyze when you're looking at a source. I use the acronym SODA, S-O-D-A, to help me remember. So we're going to ask ourselves about our source. Is this source original, derivative, or authored? S-O-D-A, SODA. So what are sources? Well, a source is a noun. It's a person or thing that you go to find information. People you interview, a person's diary, family histories, a variety of history books, cemeteries, and documents like church, employment, census, court, and immigration records, old photos, family heirlooms and artifacts, and much, much more are all considered sources. But what is an original source? An original source is the actual record, and it's not based on anything else. So here are some examples. This right here is a digital copy of an original record from Mitchell County, North Carolina. It's the Mitchell County Marriage Register found on Family Search. The marriages were recorded when the minister or the justice of the peace reported to the county clerk the marriages that he had performed for a certain time period. You'll notice they're not in alphabetical order or chronological by date. And down here on the 7th of April, 1893, Robert Ellis, 25 years old, got a marriage license with Lydia Gooch, who was 19. They were married 2 days later, and it's on the next page, but it took too much room, so I just showed you the first page. They were married 2 days later by a justice of the peace. This is original record. Okay, the next one is a digital record from Family Search of the original land deed between Wiley Tipton and William Renfro, and it was dated the 31st of December, 1868 in Yancey County, North Carolina. Look at the old handwriting. That's another clue. Over here is a DNA ethnicity report, and it was provided by the testing company, and it's also considered an original source. This is an example of an ethnicity estimate for my mom. Original sources are preferred by genealogists because they are not based on any other record. They are generally your best source. But remember, one original source is never enough. A good genealogist detective wants more sources to help build a case. So here's an example of a derivative source. Derivative means it was derived. It came from another record. This right here is a general index to marriage licenses for Mitchell County, North Carolina. It's a derivative source. It's typed really nicely. It's in alphabetical order because it was copied from the original. Down at the bottom here are my great-grandparents, Robert Ellis and Lydia Gooch. They got their marriage license on the 7th of April, 1893, and they were married on the 9th of April, 1893. So if we go back to the previous, this is the derivative, and it was copied from the original, which is right here. This document was derived from the other one. Okay, now I wanted to show you this other one. So this one right here is a handwritten copy of birth, marriages, and death records from Isaac P. Tipton's family Bible. He was born in 1809, right here. And a young girl was fascinated with this old Bible in their house that had names of her ancestors that dated in the 1800s. And she made a copy. Look, you can tell this is a young person's handwriting. She made a copy of all the genealogical information in the Bible. A family member then borrowed that Bible and never ever returned it. No vital records exist for all the individuals that she recorded because they were born and died long before Carter County, Tennessee recorded any births and deaths. They didn't record until 1881. So this little derivative source by a young girl is absolutely valuable, even though it's derivative, because the original Bible is gone. It has disappeared. Now here's the third type of the source. It's called an authored source, and it was drawn from original and derivative sources to create a piece of work. But the easiest way to remember is that it has an author. It was written by someone who gathered information together and includes the writer's conclusions. So this first example over here on the left is an authored source. It's a book that was written by my great aunt. Her name was Pearl Ellis, and she wrote it about her grandparents, Samuel Cass and Gooch. It's a mixture of original and derivative sources with a little dab of historical fiction to make it more exciting. Great book. This is a journal by the North Carolina Genealogical Society. It contains documented research reports on North Carolina family history topics, and it's written by different authors. Online family trees are considered authored sources because they are authored by the person that created the tree. They are great for hints, but you need to analyze the sources, information, and evidence that you discover on an online tree to make sure it is accurate. Also notice the ancestry DNA throughline trees and my heritage theory of relativity trees are all authored. Ancestry and MyHeritage, they look at your DNA results and they attempt to match them with online trees that were authored by someone else. Remember, those hints are only as accurate as the information is accurate in the tree. So you always want to verify those ancestry through lines that are suggested, just to make sure that they're correct. Okay, so we've analyzed sources. Now we're moving to look at the information that the sources provide. And we are asking this time, who gave the information for this source? So let's look at what we need to analyze with the information that we find. So here's information. You're going to evaluate information by determining if it is P for primary, S for secondary, or U for undetermined. Now, I have a hard time remembering all of these categories, so I always have to use an acronym. So I use an acronym similar to the earlier SOTA idea that helps me when I'm remembering what to analyze for information. So this may be silly, but it works for me. IPSU, I prefer Sprite undiluted. Maybe it works for you, or maybe you can come up with your own acronym. So a detective looks for reliable information from eyewitnesses that have no bias and no motivation to report incorrect information. So does a genealogist. When genealogists look at a document, they should ask these questions to determine reliability. Who gave the information for this record? If it was recorded by someone who was an eyewitness to an event, it's called primary. And here's how you're going to remember it. Primary. They're eyewitnesses. And then here's an example of secondary information. So here's Becky. She's telling Sarah all about the most embarrassing thing that happened to her at school today. Now, that's going to be primary information because she was the eyewitness of what happened and she's telling her friend. But then when Sarah tells Joe about the most embarrassing thing that happened to Becky, that is secondary information because Sarah was not there. She was not an eyewitness. So Joe is getting information secondhand. That is secondhand information. Then if you have absolutely no idea in the world who the information came from, it's considered undetermined. So primary information is usually considered more accurate than secondary. However, some people are not always accurate in what they report. For instance, some misrepresent their age. My Uncle Dan Ellis lied about his age on his enlistment. He wanted to fight in World War II, but he wasn't old enough. So he told them that he was 18 years old when he was really only 16. And some people lied about their age because they were young and they wanted to get married and they didn't want to have to get parental consent. And then what about those women who seem to get younger in every 10 years in the census? In addition, there are also mistakes in records, even if it was primary information, because some people may really not have known the answers to questions and they just guessed. They may be wrong. Sometimes the records are damaged or hard to read, and therefore, even if it was primary information, it might be unreliable because you can't read the document accurately. Here's some more examples of primary information by someone who was an eyewitness. So a birth certificate is considered primary information because it was recorded at the event of a birth and it was filled out by a witness to the birth. A family Bible is primary information if the events were recorded from eyewitnesses. Now, this is a page out of my grandmother's family Bible, and I know her handwriting. This is her handwriting right here. Now, I know she was an eyewitness to her marriage. She was an eyewitness to the death of her husband, Ambrose Coffey. But I want you to look at the handwriting for the death of my grandmother. It's different. It is not the same as my grandmother's. And I recognize that handwriting because it's my Aunt Clara's handwriting. And I know that she was an eyewitness to her mother, Evelyn Tipton's death. So those are all primary information. But what was Evelyn Tipton not an eyewitness to? She did not see her husband's birth. She was not there as an eyewitness. So that piece of information right there is not primary, but it is reliable information because we all know a wife always knows her husband's birthday. Now, he may not know hers, but she will always know his. And that goes for anniversary too. Okay, and then what about her birth right here? So Evelyn Tipton's birth, she recorded, she was there, but she's not going to remember it. She was told that date by her parents. So even though it's considered secondary, it's still a reliable source because not many parents are going to lie about the birth of their child, the date. Okay, this last example is a pension record for David M.C. Tipton, who kept getting turned down when he applied for a Civil War pension. When he was interviewed, he gave his age. He told them where he lived, when he enrolled in the Union Army. He told them the name of his commander. He told when he was discharged. He gave him his height, the color of his complexion, the color of his hair, the color of his eyes. And then he listed all his health issues as a result of the war. He told about his kidney disease. He had hemorrhaging of the bowels. He had rheumatism. All this was firsthand information from David Tipton. So this is extremely valuable. Here are other sources that contain primary information. Vital records like marriage or divorce and family deeds and military records and court records and naturalization records. Even DNA reports, because the informant on a DNA report is the DNA company that performed the DNA test. So that's considered primary information. A report by someone without firsthand knowledge, in other words, they were not an eyewitness, is considered secondary information. So published genealogies and town and local histories and periodicals and atlases and biographies are all secondary information. So you just ask yourself, was this written by someone that had firsthand knowledge? If not, it's probably secondary. Can a record have both primary and secondary information in it? We saw that. in the family Bible. So let's think also about a death certificate. Here's a death certificate of Evelyn Tipton, my grandmother. The information came from the informant. Now, when my own mother died, I was the informant for my mother's death certificate. I was with her when she passed, so her death information was primary. But what about the birth information that I provided for my mother's death certificate? I wasn't a witness to my mother's birth, so that is secondary. And that just shows you that when you analyze, you need to look at every single piece of information in a record and ask yourself, who provided this information? Okay, the next thing we evaluate is if it's undetermined. Undetermined information means you cannot determine who provided the information. Now, when the census enumerator came around, who was the person that gave the information? We're really not sure. The 1940 census is the only census that provides the name of who gave the information to the enumerator. And that's why it's always important to look at all the censuses that a person could have appeared in, because you do not know who gave the information on the census. Was it grandpa with bad hearing, or 5-year-old Susie, or the next door neighbor, or maybe it was even the enumerator taking a wild guess when no one was home? Ask yourself, who provided this information when you're reading an obituary, reading a website article, or looking at an online tree? An obituary is usually written by close family members, so it's probably a reliable source, but do you know who provided the information? What about tombstones? Who provided that information? Most likely close family members, but not necessarily. There is nothing on a tombstone that tells you specifically who provided that information. You can figure that the death dates are probably accurate if the stone was put on the grave at the time of death, but who provided the birth information? Now, here's a good example from Find a Grave. Here's a grave of Captain Robert Bean, companion of Daniel Boone and hero of the Kings Mountain battle in the Revolutionary War. He's also an ancestor of mine. This grave is marked by rocks in a Marion County, Tennessee graveyard with 2 plaques on it with different information. Both plaques state that Captain Robert Bean died in 1824. But the birth years differ. This one says 1750, this one says 1764. Who provided the information and when was it provided? Well, this plaque right here was erected in 1917. Okay, that is, let's see, figure my math. That's 93 years after the death. This one was erected in 1998. That's 174 years after his death. Both plaques say that they were erected by Robert Bean's descendants. Well, that narrows it down to thousands of possibilities of who gave the information. So we're going to say that's undetermined information. That makes the information suspect. So even more suspect when you discover records that Captain Robert Bean actually died in Hawkins County, Tennessee in 1793. So this is a great example of 2 men named Robert Bean getting their information all scrambled together. And I'm going to pound this again. Online trees that trace your family back to kings and queens and famous military and political leaders, or to those Mayflower passengers that we all want to be related to. Ask yourself, who provided this information? And just saying, I got it from Jane Doe's online tree is not the correct answer. Did Jane Doe provide the information for the birth, marriage, and death? Or did she just copy that tree from somebody else? If you can't determine who provided the information, it's undetermined. So remember, the whole point of analyzing information is to determine how reliable is the information in this source. So now we move from analyze, we looked at sources, looked at the information and sources, and now we're going to look at the evidence provided by the information. Evidence will hopefully lead a good detective to solve his case. Evidence for a genealogist will hopefully answer the research question. Evidence is divided into three types: direct evidence, indirect evidence, and negative evidence. Suppose a detective was trying to answer the question, did John Spain murder Robert Ellis? If several eyewitnesses saw John Spain kill Robert Ellis, that is direct evidence because it answers directly the question, did John Spain murder Robert Ellis? If no one was a witness to the crime, the detective has to continue to build a case. Let's say the detective found the murder weapon and it had John Spain's fingerprints on it. They also located his cell phone and it showed that he was at the location when the murder took place. And then they found Robert Ellis's DNA all over John Spain's clothes. All of this is indirect evidence because it took several pieces of correlating evidence to answer the question, did John Spain murder Robert Ellis? Why, yes, he did. But if there is no evidence that can be found to implicate John Spain, then that's negative evidence. John Spain was a primary suspect, but the evidence showed that he wasn't where the detective assumed he would be. There were no fingerprints, there was no DNA, there was no weapon. His cell phone showed he was somewhere else at the time of the crime. That negative evidence is powerful because it proves that Spain was not the murderer. A genealogist begins with a research question, like one a distant cousin wanted me to help her with. She wanted to know, who is the father of Samuel Edward Tipton, who was known as Ed? He was born on the 22nd of June in about 1873 in Georgia, and she knew that he died in Florida. So we looked at that death certificate. And I said, oh my gosh, here it is the death certificate. There it is right there. Ed Tipton, that's what he went by. Ed Tipton died and his parents were Ben Tipton and somebody Hart. And the informant was Mrs. Dicey Tipton, which was his wife. Now, that was easy. She should know that. It explicitly answered the question, who was the father of Samuel Edward Tipton? So that makes it direct evidence. But remember, one source is not enough. So we looked for other sources that could corroborate the death certificate. We searched the censuses for Ben Tipton and we found nothing. We couldn't find a Ben Tipton anywhere. So we went back looking to the previous generation, to Samuel Edward, Ed Tipton, see if we could find him living in a household of his parents. The 1880 census had Eddie Tipton and his siblings in the household of William and Elsie Tipton. Maybe, just maybe, Eddie was Edward. So we followed each family member in William Tipton's 1880 household through the federal and the state censuses. We looked at maps, we looked at city directors, we read local histories. We knew that they were farmers, so we studied the agricultural history of the area. We noticed that family members and neighbors moved to the same place and they always lived around each other. We made a timeline, and by looking at all those pieces of evidence and putting them together, we proved that William Tipton, not Ben Tipton on that death certificate, William Tipton was really the father of Samuel Edward Tipton. In this case, the indirect evidence was more accurate than the direct evidence. Now, negative evidence is when you don't find what you think should be there. Remember, for example, you track someone through all the censuses and then, you go through the 1880 to 1930s. They're in the same place every single year. And then poof, all of a sudden he disappears. What are some possibilities? Well, the family could have moved away, or maybe the person died. And that is important information to know because it can lead you to other sources like probate records, and court records that could provide more information about the family? Or what about DNA evidence? My mom told me for years that I had Cherokee ancestry, but neither my DNA, her sister's DNA, or several cousins show any Native American heritage. So that is negative evidence. Here's a review of analyzing evidence. Direct evidence answers the research question explicitly or directly. Indirect evidence does not answer it explicitly. It takes several pieces of corroborating information to answer that research question. And then negative evidence, when you're looking for information where you expect it to be and it's not there, that's negative evidence. But that negative evidence can also be valuable. And here's how I remember. Here's another silly acronym that works for me when I'm remembering off the top of my head, what do I need to look for in evidence? I remember every drink is nice. EDIN, every drink is nice. So in conclusion, you are a genealogist detective and your job is to analyze the sources, information, and evidence you find to help you prove a relationship or solve a research problem. You're going to analyze sources, the information, and evidence by asking first, is this source the original record? Or is it derivative, meaning it was created or copied from other records? Or was it authored, which means it's compiled information from a variety of sources? And then you ask for information. Who provided this information for this source? Was it primary, meaning was that person an eyewitness? Or was it secondary or secondhand information? Or maybe it was undetermined because I can't determine at all who provided the information. And lastly, is the evidence from the information direct? Does it explicitly, directly answer my research question? Or is it indirect, which means I have to look at multiple sources and corroborate all the pieces of evidence to answer that research question? And what if it's negative evidence? If you received your DNA results and you discovered that you are not related to who you thought you were, that's negative evidence. So in closing, if you want to be a better genealogist, then you have to remember, accuracy is fundamental to genealogical research. Without it, a family's history would be fiction. I hope that you will use this process of evidence analysis while researching your own family, because if you do, you have a much better chance that your evidence is reliable and what you have in your family tree is accurate. Here are my sources for this presentation. Use the Genealogy Standards, Evidence Explained, and Nicole Dyer from Family Locket. It's a webinar. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Laura, very much. A wonderful presentation, very informative. If you have questions, please either type them into the chat or using the Q&A feature. We did have a couple of requests for a handout, and I told them that we could work with you on getting something afterward and that we could attach when we put the recording up.
Okay, I'll do that.
We'll give it another minute. It sounds like it was very straightforward presentation, so maybe didn't prompt any questions other than maybe questions of how can I apply this in my own research. I hope everyone's asking themselves that question.
I think that if they ask more questions of what they're looking at, instead of just saying this is, oh, I got this online tree, or Aunt Mabel sent me this that she copied from somewhere and we don't know where it came from, but it says that I'm related to the Queen of England. So, if we start asking more questions, then anytime we ask more questions, it's going to make our research and our family trees more accurate.
All right, we have a comment from Shelley. I really appreciate the presentation. It was very helpful. Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Shelley.
you.
I think one question, Laura, is as you're doing your research, when you find evidence to support your conclusions, oftentimes, you may attach those, to your tree or add them as a source. But when you're organizing your research and you have evidence that you're not quite sure yet where it fits, and you haven't fully analyzed it yet, and so you're not yet ready to attach it somewhere or put it as a footnote, how do you organize that that kind of information? Where do you put it so that you can remember to finish analyzing it and then decide later where to put it?
Well, I'm basically paranoid because I know that if I put something on Ancestry or put something on Family Search, that other people who may not know the process or have not got as much experience will just assume that everything is correct that they see. So I really don't put anything on Ancestry or Family Search until I know.
Mm-hmm.
I have my own, I have Roots Magic, and I keep all of my ideas of what I think it might possibly be, or here is a really cool document, but I'm not sure whether this is the correct person or not, because there's so many people with the same name. I have to wiggle that out before I can put it into Ancestry or put it into Family Search. So I keep all my hypotheses and all my thoughts in my own personal Roots Magic account so that nobody else will grab onto it and send it out and it be copied over and over and over and be wrong information. So that's what I do.
That's good advice. Well, thank you again. We don't have any other questions, so thank you, Laura. And just a moment, I'm going to share my screen again and just say thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We'll hope you join us we hope you will join us for our next webinar, which is on the 20th of July with Richard Miller on finding and fixing tangles in your family tree with Goldie May. A recording of this webinar will be made available next week. You can view that on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fhl_webinars@byu.edu or through Facebook and Twitter. Thank you and have a wonderful week.